Good day. We are going to show you how to paint Barker board, also known as Barker tile.
Tempered hardboard, hardboard tile, tile board, ceramic tile. But it also applies to steel, glass, and anything else that's really shiny and slippery and hard.
You can see right here, it's a very thin, very hard board, very waterproof. There's such a thing as very waterproof. They're waterproof words now, but it's waterproof. And is not all that uncommon in tubs, tub surrounds and things like that. And you can see here, yeah, ours needs some work. It's had a good life, but it is now in need of repair. And I was originally going to tile this, but I decided that paint will be less expensive and probably do a better job, mostly because there's a lot of finicky corners and things like that. Let's explain what you need to get this done. And the most important thing you need to know about is high bonding primer. So this is not regular primer. For challenging surfaces require advanced adhesion. So you can use any of the brands you want, but as you can see here, it's suggesting over tile, glass, glossy finishes, metal, so on and so forth. Now, this wasn't cheap. This cost about $65 Canadian, so about $50 US. Not cheap. Then once that's on the Barker board, you're going to want to paint it to look probably, well, at least I wanted to make it look like tile. So I decided to use just interior high gloss pure white. Now, you think, okay, we'll just paint it. Nah, not quite that easy. A couple of things you should be doing first. The very first thing you should be doing is using a knife to cut out any of the calking. So the calking that's going around the edges, if you can get rid of that before you paint, that's a win. The next thing is sanding. So this is technically not required, but highly, highly recommended. So what I've done is I've gone out and I've bought some 120 grit sanding blocks. I'm going to cut these in two, by the way, because they're just too big. And what I'm going to do is give this a gentle, emphasis on gentle sand. I'm not trying to get rid of the finish. I'm just trying to scuff it up a bit so that there's a little more to adhere to. Once that's done, I will use these rollers. These are foam rollers. Now these are 10 mil foam rollers. You'd be better off with 5 mil. Well, at least from a finish perspective, you'd be better off with 5 mil. The problem with 5 mil rollers is you'll never stop putting the roller back in the pan. It will be a constant use, in which case you will be probably screwing up the finish of your surface. So you're probably, well, I think, and the people at Home Depot think that, at least the two that I spoke to, think that the 10 mil is the right for this type of job. I also have a good quality paintbrush to hit those spots that I just can't get with the roller. You know, the tops near the ceilings and things like that. Once that's done, I will use proper mold and mildew resistant silicone to reseal the corners, to replace the caulking. And of course, before I do any of it, I will be using painter's tape to go around the edges and make sure I don't make a mess of the wall. Not bad. Okay, I've gone and got myself a longer blade. I've got, 12 of these different blades, as you might imagine, like a lot of people do, from various other projects, and the longer blade really does help. Look at that. Like a dream. Something to keep in mind if you're watching this thing, if he's not getting it all, is I'm going to use a sanding block afterwards, and I've got one with an edge. It's going to go in there and really rip that up. So, and again, it does not have to be perfect because I'm going to recalk it, so it just has to be good. As you can see, some of it just comes off, and some of it, especially when it's in a corner like this, you've really got to fiddle with. But take your time and you'll get it done. Okay, as you can see here, this board's pulled up for some reason, and I can tell that it's pulled up to about here, so I'm going to trim this off because, of course, you don't want to paint over loose stuff. There we go. Let's just cut that out. And then I will fill that with something, most likely caulking actually, because that's an easy fix. It's cheap, it's waterproof, and it'll keep us protected. And after I paint it, it'll look great. Okay, so now comes the sanding, and I'm going to use a 120 grit paper. If you don't know anything about, well, it's actually a block. If you don't know anything about these types of sanding materials, the higher the number, the finer the grain. So you want to use something that's at least 100 because you don't want to really rip this up. You just want to gently scuff it. Now what I've done is I've taken one of these larger blocks because it's too large for what I need, and I've just used an X-Acto knife here to cut it in half. And I figure I'll need 2 blocks. I'll probably go through this plus another one. Now, because we're in COVID times, I'm going to use my N95 mask. And I say because of COVID, it's really because I've got the mask handy. I probably wouldn't. It probably isn't necessary, but it doesn't cost me anything to put it on. So that's what I'm going to do. One of the nice things about these wedges is that that's about 45 degrees, and so is that. So I can get in that corner. So the reason to use a mask is because there's some really fine particles here, and you just don't want those in your lungs. Okay, now what you want to do is use a vacuum to clean out all the loose bits of silicone. That stuff, if it goes down your drain, isn't biodegradable. It's going to screw up the sewer system, but way more importantly, from your end personally, you're going to get a clog, and Drano is not going to dissolve silicone, so you're going to need to get a snake. Just the bottom line is spend 5 seconds, vacuum it out. Let's do that right now. Okay, now that the vacuuming is done, take an old towel, something with a fine, not too furry. No, this is a towel that I've previously destroyed. I guess you can't tell, but just trust me, it's destroyed. And what you want to do is wet it down. Now, the theory is that you should use mineral spirits to get this perfectly clean. I talked to 2 different painters about it who said, yeah, that's the theory, but they wouldn't. So, including one of those, a journeyman. So, I think it's just fine. As long as you make sure it's very, very clean, you'll be okay. What you don't want to have happening is the base coat sticking to dirt or sticking to the dust that you just created, because obviously there's no bond there. Okay, so let's get to it. So I've just got a damp cloth, and I'm just going to wipe this down, and I'll have to go over it a couple of times, and we'll let it sit and dry, and then we'll get to taping off and painting it. All right, now any defects you want to deal with, now's a great time, because you're going to have to let this dry completely before you start painting. So I'm just going to take a little waterproof kitchen and bath. A little pro tip, you can just use a piece of cardboard to smooth this. It's not great, but it's better than it was, and I'm not going to replace this board. So that is as good as it's going to get. I'll just let that dry now. Time to tape down. So use some good quality painter's tape, and make sure, if you're working on something acrylic like this, that you run your finger along the edge. Otherwise, that having the painter's tape down isn't going to be enough. The paint will still go under. So I went back to Home Depot and I changed the large gallon for a quart or 4 liters of bonding primer because this small can will cover about 80 to 100 square feet. And it turns out that I'm only going to do about 65, 70 square feet. So this should finish it quite nicely. And this can was about $22, $23 Canadian, so 18, 19 US. And something I want to stress again is that this is good for, this whole procedure I've been showing you is good for tile, glass, glossy finish woods, metals, basically any sort of really high gloss, low permeability material. This bonding primer will stick to, and then you can paint over top of it quite nicely. Again, we're using a 10 mil foam roller because a 5 mil will mean you'll be dunking paint over and over again, and that will not help your finish. So the first thing I'm doing is getting all of the edges with this brush and getting all the weird parts, things that really need heavy coating, like this yellow line I've got up here from where glue and other things have come out over the years. So I've done the cut-ins, you can see here, going around the plumbing and anything that's tight. A bit shockingly, you'd think this high bond paint would be trouble for your brushes. If you bought good brushes and you reused them, which is what you should do for this. But I was told it just washed out with soap and water. And look, it's just washing out beautifully. So even using a 10 mil brush means I gotta keep reloading the roller over and over again. It's just the nature of this job. Best to keep even strokes going up and down, but I do want to make sure I catch everything along the bottom, along these edges where I'll cut in, and that I'm not leaving paintbrush marks because I don't want the lines in it. I want it to be smooth. And you may have to do a little bit of cross-hatching, which is not generally the best idea, but just to get into those, if you've got a tile pattern like I have, you need to make sure that the depths of that tile pattern are covered. Well, even the primer looks 1,000 times better than what was there before. Now remember that the primer's job is to soak into the material and allow a base for the paint to sit on. And the number one problem with painting any of these surfaces is they'll paint just fine when you do it initially, but when you go to scrub them later because they get dirty for some reason, you'll find that the paint will come off, and then that is what we call a giant problem. Well, it's not a problem if you've used this high bonding primer, because it will not only soak into these high gloss, it will soak into these high gloss, very hard surfaces that are not permeable, and it will provide a base for that paint to sit on that you can scrub, assuming you get proper paint. Now the key is to let it dry. You can let it dry for a couple of hours, but you're best to let it dry overnight. So let it sit for a day and harden up good and solid. Now, these there is an odor that comes off of this, but it's not giving me a headache. I don't have a fan on. I'm sure some people would complain about it, but it doesn't bother me at all. I could have used the old roller. It probably would have been fine, but I want to do this as properly as possible, so I've spent the $6 and got another 10 mil roller. Okay, so this is nice and dry. I don't see any spots that look anything other than just perfect. So let's get to it and make it glossy and put a final coat on. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure it's a fairly light coat. You might have to do more than, have to is a bit much. You might choose to do more than one coat. Don't try to glop it on. I want to make sure that any little divots or spots are filled. It's one of the nice things about enamel, it is a heavier paint, And while it's not exactly filler, it does, it does fill. I'm just looking for lines. I don't see any. I think I'm pretty good. So it's generally not a good idea to start changing your direction, but if you've got some lines that just aren't taking the paint like you would like, you're really not going to have much choice. So what I recommend is turning the roller sideways, getting into those grooves, and then re-rolling it up and down, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. All right, so let's take a closer look. So that looks pretty nice to me. Certainly drastically better than it was before. And remember that anybody can paint their tile or their glass or their steel. That's not what we're doing here. We're doing it properly so that you can scrub it, because bathtubs and showers get gross and you need to be able to do that. That's the point of using that base that we used. And it's also the point of using this high quality enamel that is mold and mildew resistant. I've got to pull the tape off, and a little pro tip for that, if you start pulling it, and let's just try right now. If we start pulling this tape off and it starts lifting, good, this is not doing it. Well, let me explain it anyway. If you start lifting this tape off and it starts to lift the paint with it, pulls it off because it's not stuck in properly, stuck down properly, adhered properly. What you can do is take an X-Acto knife, very gently put a little blade on it. I'm not going to have to do that, thank God. So this is great. All right, so now that the paint is done and it looks pretty good and it's cured, now you've got to put the caulking back on. And that, if you're me, is a problem because I cannot make it smooth. I just can't do it. I've tried. I do the finger technique. I do whatever. The bottom line is I can't do it. So I used to have my wife do it, but that's not going to happen anymore. And you can do the math on that. So what I've done is watch a pile of other people's videos to figure out a way that'll actually work for me. So if you're useless at caulking, I'm a rough guy. I don't do finish work very well. And it turns out there is an easy way that I just didn't know about, and I'm going to show it to you right now. It's called tape and spoon. So what you want to do is tape, use painter's tape, very close to the edge, don't leave a big gap. Okay, so once you've got it taped down, use your caulking. Of course, you should be using silicone kitchen and bath, anti-mold, anti-mildew stuff, which is what I've got here. And it doesn't make any difference whether it's coming from a gun like this or a little tube that you buy. Just depends on how much you have to do. And what you should do is just squeeze it in. Actually, this is going shockingly better than it usually does for me. Even just this. I just can't seem to keep it even pressure. And don't worry about it being a bit chunky, because we're going to smooth it out. The two keys are the tape and the spoon. So use a plastic spoon. Make sure it has water on it, because just trust me, you need to make sure there's water on it. And what you do is just push it in and apply pressure, because you want to squish it in there. And it'll build up on the spoon, and that's just fine. And then immediately pull the tape off. If you don't, the surface tension, there will be surface tension that gets built up on the caulking right away, and you don't want that. You want to be able to break that beforehand so that it can lay down a little better. And while that is not 100% perfect, it is very, very good. So here's an interesting situation where it's mostly flat. So how do you do that? you just you turn your spoon sideways. So you get your little plastic spoon here and you adjust, turn it sideways and push it along. All right, so let's take a look at it. Here's the finished work. It looks pretty solid to me. I don't see any problems. I don't see any dark marks. I don't see any dyes that came through. Caulking's in great shape. Yeah, this worked out beautifully. Now, the big thing to remember about this is that unlike other people that just paint their tile or glass or steel or Barker board or whatever they've got, and it'll look great while you initially work on it, it will scrub off in the future. This, however, will not, because it's got that special Behr primer.